The crowbar slipped between the floorboards with the sound of wood splitting after 70 years of holding secrets, and Marcus Webb's 7-year-old son was the first to see what lay beneath. Owen didn't scream, didn't cry out, just went perfectly still the way children do when their minds are processing something they lack the vocabulary to name. Marcus looked down into the gap he'd created, his headlamp illuminating what had been hidden in the crawlspace beneath the barn's oak floor, and his hands started shaking so badly he had to set down the crowbar before he dropped it. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Dad, Owen said, his voice barely a whisper. Is that, go outside, Marcus interrupted, keeping his voice steady despite the adrenaline flooding his system. Go wait by the truck. Don't come back in until I tell you. Owen obeyed without argument, recognizing the tone his father used for serious things, for situations that required immediate compliance without questions. Marcus listened to his son's footsteps crossing the barn floor, heard the door creak open and closed, then pulled out his phone with hands that still weren't steady. The 911 dispatcher's voice was professionally calm when she answered, trained to handle emergencies without emotion. Marcus took a breath before speaking, trying to organize words for something he'd never expected to find. I need police at the old Morrison barn, County Road 47 just past Sutter's Creek. I'm doing salvage work and I found, he paused, making himself look again to be certain, his headlamp beam confirming what his first glance had registered. I found human remains. Multiple people. Looks like they've been here a long time. 12 hours earlier, Marcus had purchased the Morrison barn for $450 at a county liquidation sale, seeing it not as property but as raw materials he could sell to keep himself and Owen housed for another month. The construction company he'd worked for had folded in August, his unemployment had run out in October, and November's rent was due in 6 days with his bank account showing $32 and change. The barn had sat abandoned on Morrison family land for decades after the property was subdivided and sold off piece by piece. The county had taken it for unpaid taxes 2 years ago, and nobody wanted a structure that was too deteriorated to restore but too well built to collapse on its own. The listing specified sale for salvage only, buyer responsible for demolition and removal, which meant Marcus could buy it cheap if he was willing to do the work of tearing it down and hauling away materials he could sell to scrap dealers and reclamation yards. He'd done the math carefully. Oak beams that old were valuable to people restoring historic homes. The metal roofing could be sold as architectural salvage. Even the hand-forged hardware, hinges and latches and nails made by blacksmiths before mass production, had value to craftspeople and collectors. If he worked methodically, salvaged everything marketable, he could probably clear $3,000 after expenses. Enough to cover rent, buy groceries, keep Owen in school clothes that fit, maybe even fix the truck's transmission that was making concerning noises. Owen had come with him that morning because childcare cost money Marcus didn't have and because his son had learned to be helpful on salvage jobs, sorting hardware into containers, stacking usable lumber, staying out of the way when his father was doing dangerous work. They'd driven to the barn just after sunrise, the November air cold enough that their breath showed in clouds. The Morrison barn stood alone in a field that had gone wild with scrub brush and volunteer trees, its isolation probably why nobody had salvaged it already despite the valuable materials it contained. Built in the 1940s, it was classic tobacco barn construction, massive oak framing, board and batten siding, a gambrel roof designed to maximize drying space. It had been empty for years, its last agricultural use probably decades past, a monument to farming methods the modern world had abandoned. Marcus had started with the roof, carefully removing metal sheeting that would bring decent money at the salvage yard. Owen had helped by organizing the fasteners, his small hands sorting screws and nails into coffee cans they'd brought for that purpose. They'd worked through the morning, Marcus methodical and careful despite the pressure of knowing every hour counted, that rent waited for no one and landlords didn't accept explanations about bad luck and economic downturns. Around noon, he'd moved inside to assess the floor. The barn's main level was raised about 3 feet above grade, built on oak joists with thick plank flooring that had weathered to silver gray. The wood alone was worth serious money if he could remove it without too much damage, Reclaimed barnwoods sold for premium prices to people building rustic furniture or renovating homes with authentic materials. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. He'd started in the corner farthest from the door, using a pry bar to lift the first plank, testing whether the boards would come up intact or whether they'd split and fracture. The wood had resisted, held by square-cut nails that had been there since construction, but Marcus had experience with this kind of work, knew the right leverage points and the patience required. The first board had come up clean, revealing the crawlspace beneath, dirt floor, oak joists, shadows that his headlamp couldn't fully penetrate. He'd set the board aside and started on the second, working systematically, trying not to think about the rent deadline or the dwindling groceries or Owen's winter coat that was getting too small. The third board was when everything changed. When Marcus pried it up and shined his light into the gap, he'd seen what looked like fabric, the kind of rotted material that suggested clothing from another era. He'd assumed at first he'd found some old storage, forgotten belongings from when the barn was in active use. But as he removed more boards, widened the opening, the pattern became clear and horrifying. Not old storage. Bodies. 3 of them arranged side by side in the crawlspace, wrapped in what had once been blankets or tarps but had deteriorated over decades into fragments barely recognizable as textile. The remains were skeletal, long past decomposition, but the arrangement was deliberate, careful, suggesting they'd been placed there with intention rather than hidden in panic. Now Marcus stood in the abandoned barn waiting for police to arrive, his son outside by the truck, his salvage job transformed into a crime scene. He didn't touch anything else, didn't disturb the floor further, just stood there processing the implications of what he'd found while his mind tried to reconcile desperate need for salvage income with the moral weight of discovering evidence of something terrible that had happened in this place. The first sheriff's deputy arrived within 20 minutes, a young officer named Torres who approached with the cautious assessment of someone trained to evaluate situations before committing. Marcus met him outside, explained what he'd found, watched Torres's expression shift from skeptical to serious as he looked into the barn and saw what Marcus's headlamp had revealed. "You didn't touch anything after you found them?" Torres asked. "Just removed enough floorboards to see what I was looking at. Then I called." "And you bought this barn when?" "This morning. County salvage auction. I've got the paperwork in my truck." Marcus felt the need to establish he was legitimate, that he hadn't broken into someone else's property or done anything that would make him seem suspicious. Torres called for backup, his radio chatter bringing more units and what sounded like investigative personnel. Within an hour, the quiet field that had held only Marcus and Owen and an abandoned barn was filling with official vehicles, officers establishing perimeter, crime scene technicians preparing to document whatever lay beneath the Morrison barn's floor. A detective named Sarah Vance took Marcus's statement, her questions methodical and professional, establishing timeline and intent without accusation. She was maybe 40, with the tired eyes of someone who'd seen too much but maintained compassion anyway. "The Morrison family owned this land for how long?" she asked after getting Marcus's account of the morning. "I don't know the history. The auction listing just said it was county-seized property, available for salvage. But you know the Morrison name meant something around here. James Morrison ran a successful tobacco operation through the 50s and 60s. Big family, well-respected, employed a lot of local people during harvest seasons." Vance paused, studying Marcus's face. "The property got subdivided after James died in 1971. The family scattered, some stayed local, most moved away. This barn's been empty since at least the 80s. Marcus processed this information, understanding where she was leading. "You're thinking the bodies might be from when the Morrisons owned it." "I'm not thinking anything yet. But yeah, the timeline suggests whoever's under that floor has been there a long time. Decades, minimum." Vance looked at the barn, her expression showing the calculation of someone trying to solve a puzzle with insufficient pieces. "You planning to continue salvage work?" "I need to. I bought the barn, used money I don't have for materials I need to sell. If I can't salvage it, I can't pay this month's rent." Vance was quiet for a moment, and Marcus saw something shift in her expression, recognition of desperation she'd probably encountered before, understanding that crime scenes didn't care about people's financial struggles. The barn's going to be sealed for a while. Crime scene, potential homicide investigation, we'll need time to process everything. I'm sorry, but you won't be able to continue work here until we're finished. Marcus felt his stomach drop, the careful calculations that had made the salvage job financially viable collapsing. He'd spent $450 on property he now couldn't access, couldn't work, couldn't convert into the income he desperately needed. The rent deadline hadn't moved, but his ability to meet it had just evaporated. How long? He asked, keeping his voice level despite the panic building in his chest. Depends what we find. Could be days, could be weeks. Old remains, we'll need forensic anthropology, historical research, possibly dental records if we can identify likely victims. Vance's expression was sympathetic but firm. I understand this creates problems for you, but 3 people were buried under that floor. Finding out what happened to them takes priority. After giving his contact information and promising to be available for additional questions, Marcus collected Owen from where he'd been waiting patiently in the truck and drove away from the Morrison barn, watching in the rearview mirror as more official vehicles arrived, as what should have been his salvation became another disaster in a year full of disasters. Owen was quiet until they were back on the main road, his small hands fidgeting with the zipper on his too small coat. Were those people murdered? He asked, his voice carrying the careful tone children use when asking about things that scare them. Marcus considered lying, protecting his son from harsh truths, but Owen had learned too much about difficulty this year to be sheltered from reality. I don't know. Maybe. Or maybe they died some other way and someone hid the bodies. The police will figure it out. But now we can't sell the barn wood. No, buddy. Now we can't sell the barn wood. So what do we do about rent? Marcus didn't have an answer that didn't sound like giving up, so he just drove, his mind churning through impossible calculations, trying to find solutions where none existed. He'd spent $450, nearly everything he had, on property he couldn't access, couldn't salvage, couldn't convert into the income that was supposed to keep them housed. The landlord wouldn't care about crime scenes or police investigations. The rent was due regardless of circumstances, and Marcus was out of options. That evening, after Owen was asleep in their cramped apartment, Marcus sat at the kitchen table researching the Morrison family, trying to understand what he'd stumbled into. The local newspaper's digital archives went back to the 1950s, and James Morrison's name appeared frequently in the early years, successful farmer, member of the Rotary Club, respected community figure whose tobacco operation employed dozens during harvest season. But the mentions thinned out in the late 60s, became sporadic in the early 70s, then stopped entirely after his death in 1971. Marcus found the obituary, noting that James had been survived by his wife Helen and 4 children, that he'd been a pillar of the agricultural community, that his funeral had drawn hundreds of mourners. What Marcus didn't find was any mention of missing persons, unsolved disappearances, or crimes that might explain 3 bodies hidden beneath a barn floor. Whatever had happened, it had either been concealed successfully or had happened to people whose absence hadn't generated the kind of attention that made newspapers. He was still searching when his phone rang, Detective Vance's name showing on the screen. Marcus answered, his stomach tight with the anticipation of bad news. Mr. Webb, I wanted to update you on what we found. Vance's voice was professional but carried an undertone Marcus couldn't quite identify. The forensic anthropologist made a preliminary assessment. The remains are definitely old, probably from the 1950s or 60s based on clothing fragments and some personal items found with the bodies. 3 individuals, likely adults based on bone structure. Marcus waited, sensing there was more. We also found something else under the floor. A metal box, sealed and preserved, containing documents and what appears to be evidence that whoever buried those bodies wanted their story told eventually. Letters, photographs, detailed accounts of what happened. Vance paused. Mr. Webb, I think you bought that barn just in time. What you found isn't just a crime scene. It's testimony from people who've been waiting 70 years for someone to hear them. Detective Vance called Marcus to the sheriff's department the next morning, her voice on the phone carrying weight that suggested the metal box's contents had revealed something significant. Marcus arranged for Owen to stay with their neighbor Mrs. Chen, a retired teacher who'd been kind about watching him when Marcus couldn't afford proper childcare, then drove to the county seat with the kind of dread that comes from knowing your life is about to get more complicated. The conference room where Vance met him was small and institutional, but she'd laid out photocopies of documents across the table with the care of someone handling evidence that mattered. Marcus could see immediately these weren't modern papers, the handwriting was old-fashioned, the paper yellowed even in the copies, the language formal in ways people didn't write anymore. "What you found isn't random violence," Vance said without preamble. "It's testimony. 3 people who worked for James Morrison died in 1967, and someone, probably multiple someones, documented exactly what happened and why, then sealed it with the bodies." She gestured to the documents. "I need you to read these because they're going to affect what happens next with your salvage rights, with the property, with everything." Marcus sat, pulling the first document closer. It was a letter, dated September 15, 1967, written in neat cursive on stationery that had Morrison Family Farm printed at the top. "My name is Helen Morrison, and I am writing this because silence has become unbearable. What happened in our barn 3 weeks ago was not an accident, was not justified, and cannot be allowed to disappear as if 3 lives meant nothing simply because they belong to people the law doesn't protect. On August 22, 1967, my husband James Morrison murdered 3 workers from our tobacco harvest, Robert Clay, Samuel Washington, and Thomas Reed. All 3 were colored men who'd worked our farm for years, who were good at their jobs and caused no trouble. James killed them because Robert dared to ask about wages they were owed, because he wouldn't accept my husband's lies about money that had been earned and should have been paid. The argument happened in the barn after dark, when most workers had left. I heard shouting, came out to find James with his hunting rifle, the 3 men backed against the wall. James was drunk, was angry about things that had nothing to do with wages, his tobacco prices dropping, his debts mounting, his pride wounded by circumstances he couldn't control. But he took that anger out on men who'd done nothing except ask for what they'd earned. I begged him to stop. Our children were in the house, could hear the shouting. But James wasn't listening to reason, was barely human in his rage. He shot all 3, methodical and cold, while I stood frozen with horror at what my husband had become. Afterward, he forced our oldest son William to help bury them under the barn floor, swore the boy to secrecy with threats of what would happen to the family if anyone knew. He told the other workers that the 3 men had left without notice, that colored people were unreliable, and this proved it. Most people believed him because James Morrison was white and respected and owned land, while the dead men were black and poor, and nobody the sheriff would investigate seriously even if questions were asked. I am a coward. I didn't stop it, didn't report it, didn't speak the truth when speaking might have mattered. I've lived 20 years with this knowledge, watching my husband act like nothing happened, watching our community treat him as a pillar while 3 men rot beneath our barn floor. James died last month, heart attack while working the fields. Some would call it justice, but justice would be those 3 men still breathing, still with their families, still earning the wages he killed them over. My children scattered after he died, none of them wanting to maintain what he built. William drinks himself sick trying to forget what he saw. The others just left, couldn't wait to escape this place and its secrets. I'm dying too, cancer. The doctors say I've got maybe 6 months. Before I go, I need someone to know the truth. Robert Clay, Samuel Washington, and Thomas Reed were murdered by James Morrison on August 22, 1967. They're buried under the tobacco barn floor. They deserved better than they got in life and death both. Their families deserve to know what happened. If anyone finds this, please tell them the truth. Tell them Helen Morrison knew it was wrong, knew her silence made her complicit, and died ashamed of her cowardice. Marcus set down the letter, his hands trembling. Vance was watching him carefully, evaluating his reaction. There's more, she said quietly, sliding over additional documents. Helen included photographs of the 3 men, copies of harvest records showing they'd worked the Morrison farm for years, even calculations of exactly how much James owed them when he killed them. She also included a letter she'd written to each man's family but never sent, apologizing for her silence. The photographs showed 3 men in work clothes, probably taken during a harvest season. They looked like any farm workers from that era, tired, serious, focused on the camera with the formality people adopted when photography was still special. Robert Clay was maybe 30 in his photo, Samuel Washington older, Thomas Reed younger with a cautious smile that made Marcus's chest ache for the life cut short. We've been researching the families, Vance continued. Robert Clay's granddaughter still lives in the county, runs a bakery downtown. Samuel Washington's family moved north after he disappeared, but we've located descendants in Michigan. Thomas Reed's family is harder to trace, but we're working on it. She paused. They've waited 57 years to know what happened. Your discovery gives them answers, gives them closure, maybe gives them justice even if it's too late for prosecution. Marcus processed this, understanding the weight of what he'd found was far heavier than 3 sets of remains. Helen Morrison sealed this with the bodies? She wanted them found? Eventually, yes. The letter suggests she knew the barn would outlast her, that eventually someone would tear it down or renovate it or do something that would reveal what was hidden. She couldn't speak while alive, fear of her husband, fear of community judgment, fear of what truth would cost her surviving children. But she made sure truth would emerge eventually. What happens now? With the barn, with my salvage rights, with everything? Vance's expression showed sympathy mixed with the practical reality of the situation. The barn is a burial site and crime scene. The bodies need to be recovered properly, documented, returned to families for proper burial. That process will take time. Your salvage work can't continue until we're finished. Marcus felt the walls closing in, the rent deadline approaching while his only source of income remained locked behind crime scene tape. How long? Weeks at minimum. Maybe longer depending on how extensive the recovery process is and whether families want additional investigation. Vance leaned forward. I know this creates hardship for you. But Marcus, you found something important. 3 men who disappeared in 1967, whose families were told lies, who were buried like trash under a barn floor, they finally get dignity. That matters. I understand it matters, Marcus said, hearing the edge in his own voice. But it doesn't pay my rent. It doesn't feed my son. I spent $450 I didn't have on property I can't access, and now I'm going to lose our apartment because I did the right thing by calling you instead of just covering up the bones and salvaging the wood anyway. The words hung in the air, Marcus immediately regretting them but unable to take them back. Vance's expression hardened slightly, recognizing the desperation that made people consider terrible choices. If you'd done that, if you'd covered up a murder scene and sold evidence, you'd be committing a felony. You'd lose more than an apartment. Her voice was firm but not unkind. I get that you're in a bad situation. But those 3 men were in a worse one, and they didn't get choices about what happened to them. Marcus nodded, shame mixing with frustration, knowing she was right but also knowing that righteousness didn't keep people housed. So what do I do? Just accept losing everything because I happened to buy the wrong barn? Before Vance could respond, someone knocked on the conference room door. A woman entered, maybe 65, with silver hair and the kind of presence that commanded attention despite her small stature. She looked at Marcus with an expression he couldn't quite read, assessment mixed with something that might have been recognition. This is Christine Clay, Vance said. Robert Clay's granddaughter. She wanted to meet the person who found her grandfather. Christine approached Marcus, extending her hand. Her grip was firm, her eyes holding his with intensity that made looking away feel impossible. Detective Vance showed me Helen Morrison's letter this morning. Showed me the photographs, the evidence, everything my family was owed 57 years ago. Her voice was steady but carried weight. My grandmother died in 1985 still not knowing what happened to her husband. Died believing he'd abandoned her, that he'd run off or gotten in trouble or just decided family wasn't worth staying for. Marcus stood, feeling the need to meet her at eye level even though he had no idea what to say. I'm sorry for your loss. For what happened to your grandfather. You didn't cause it. But you ended it, the not knowing, the wondering, the stories we told ourselves to explain why he never came home. Christine was quiet for a moment, studying Marcus's face. Detective Vance told me about your situation. About the money you spent, the salvage work you can't do, the rent you can't pay. Marcus felt his face flush, embarrassment at having his financial desperation revealed to a woman who'd just learned her grandfather was murdered. That's not your problem to worry about. Maybe not. But here's what I'm thinking. Christine pulled out a chair and sat, gesturing for Marcus to do the same. My grandfather was owed wages when James Morrison killed him. Helen's records show exactly how much, $340, which was substantial money in 1967. With interest over 57 years, accounting for what that wage theft cost my family, we're talking about significant compensation even if there's no legal mechanism to claim it. Marcus wasn't sure where this was going, but he listened. The Morrison family is scattered, but some still live locally. James's grandson David runs the farm equipment dealership on Route 9. His sister Patricia teaches at the community college. They've built respectable lives on the foundation their grandfather created through murder and wage theft. Christine's expression hardened. I've known them my whole life, been in David's store buying supplies, taking classes with Patricia. They had no idea what their grandfather did, but they benefited from it. From the farm he built with stolen wages and buried workers. Vance shifted uncomfortably. Christine, we can't prove the Morrison descendants knew about the murders. Going after them for their grandfather's crimes isn't going to work legally. I'm not talking about legal action. I'm talking about moral debt. Christine turned back to Marcus. You lost money because you found my grandfather and did the right thing by calling police. The Morrison family gained wealth because their grandfather murdered him. That's not justice, but maybe we can create something that approaches fairness. Over the next hour, Christine laid out a plan that was part confrontation and part community reckoning. She wanted to approach the Morrison descendants directly, wanted them to know what their grandfather had done and what it had cost the families of his victims. She wanted them to face the truth that their respectable lives were built on buried bodies and stolen wages. They might tell us to go to hell, Christine acknowledged. Might deny it, might claim it's not their responsibility. But David Morrison is on the County Historical Commission, Patricia Morrison teaches ethics at the college. They've built identities around being good people from good families. Learning the truth about James Morrison will destroy that identity, and maybe, just maybe, they'll feel obligated to do something that acknowledges the debt their family owes. Marcus understood what she was suggesting. You want them to compensate me for the salvage income one lost, as a way of addressing what their grandfather stole. I want them to face what their family did. If that results in them helping you, it's a start toward balancing accounts that have been unbalanced for 57 years. Christine met his eyes. You found my grandfather when you could have just sold the wood and never told anyone. That means something. That deserves recognition beyond just moral satisfaction. The meeting with the Morrison descendants happened 3 days later in a private room at the county library, arranged by Detective Vance, who'd made it clear this was outside official channels but who understood that sometimes justice required conversations law couldn't facilitate. David Morrison arrived looking confused and defensive, his sister Patricia nervous, both of them clearly uncertain why they'd been summoned to discuss a family barn that had been sold for taxes. Vance showed them the documents, the photographs, Helen Morrison's confession. Marcus watched their faces change as understanding set in, watched denial shift to horror, shift to something like grief for a grandfather they'd believed was a good man. This isn't possible, David said, his voice strained. My grandfather was respected, was known for treating workers fairly. Your grandfather was a murderer, Christine interrupted, her voice steady and hard. He killed 3 men over wages he owed them, buried them under his barn floor, and lived the rest of his life like it never happened. My grandmother died not knowing what happened to her husband because your grandfather was a coward who killed rather than pay what he owed. Patricia was crying quietly, her hands shaking as she looked at the photograph of Thomas Reed. My God. We had no idea. Nobody ever said. Because Helen Morrison was too scared to tell the truth while James was alive, and too ashamed to tell it afterward. Vance's voice was gentle but firm. But she made sure eventually someone would know. Mr. Webb found that testimony when he bought your family's barn for salvage. David turned to Marcus, his expression showing a man trying to process information that shattered his understanding of his own history. You bought the barn? For salvage? Marcus explained his situation, the financial desperation that had led him to bid on a structure nobody wanted, the discovery that had derailed his only plan for making rent. He didn't ask for sympathy, just laid out the facts with the same careful honesty he'd used when calling 911 about the bodies. So you lost money because you did the right thing, Patricia said quietly. Because you found evidence of what our grandfather did and reported it instead of just destroying evidence and taking what you needed. Yes. The room was quiet for a long moment, the weight of 70-year-old crimes sitting heavy on descendants who hadn't committed them but who'd benefited from them nonetheless. Finally, David spoke, his voice carrying the careful precision of someone making a decision that would define who he was. The barn is still technically county property until the investigation is complete. But after that, it reverts to whoever has salvage rights, which is you, Mr. Webb. He paused. What if we bought those rights from you? Paid you what the salvage would have been worth if you'd been able to complete the work, plus compensation for the time and money you've lost while the barn was sealed? Marcus felt hope flare in his chest but kept his expression neutral. What would you do with it? Turn it into a memorial, Patricia said, her voice gaining strength. A place that acknowledges what our grandfather did, that honors the men he murdered, that tells the truth about James Morrison instead of maintaining the lies he lived by. She looked at Christine. Your grandfather deserves more than being forgotten under a barn floor. All three men do. They deserve recognition, dignity, their names remembered alongside the truth about what happened to them. Christine's expression was complex, pain and anger mixing with something that might have been cautious hope. You'd do that? You'd publicly acknowledge what James Morrison did, what your family legacy is really built on. We have to, David said simply. We can't undo what he did, can't bring those men back, can't compensate your family adequately for 57 years of not knowing. But we can stop perpetuating lies, can create something that serves truth instead of reputation. He turned back to Marcus. What would fair compensation look like for your salvage rights? Marcus thought about the careful calculations he'd made, the $3,000 he'd expected to clear from material sales. But he also thought about Helen Morrison's shame, about Christine's grandmother dying without answers, about the weight of truth that was being acknowledged in this room. $5,000, he said. $3,000 for the salvage value I'm losing, $2,000 for time and expenses and the fact that I'm probably going to get evicted next week because I can't pay rent while we sort this out. David didn't hesitate. Done. I'll write a check today. Personal funds, not business, this is family debt being settled, not a transaction. He extended his hand to Marcus. Thank you for finding them. For calling police, for doing this right when you had every reason to just take what you needed and stay quiet. After the meeting, Christine walked Marcus to his truck, both of them quiet with the weight of what had just happened. Finally, she said, my grandfather was murdered over $340. You found him because you spent $450. Those numbers probably don't mean anything, but they feel significant somehow. Marcus thought about this. Your grandfather was worth more than wages. Worth more than dollars at all. But him being found, getting his story told, that happened because I was desperate enough to buy a barn nobody else wanted. Sometimes bad circumstances lead to places nobody expected. You going to be okay now? With the $5,000? For a while. Longer than I've been okay in months. Marcus paused. What happens next? With the memorial, with your family? We bury my grandfather properly, next to my grandmother like he should have been 57 years ago. Samuel Washington's family is driving down from Michigan next week to do the same. Thomas Reed's family, we're still searching, but we'll find them. Christine looked back at the library where the Morrisons were still processing the destruction of their family myth. And we make sure nobody forgets what happened. The memorial will tell the truth, all of it, no matter how uncomfortable it makes people. That evening, Marcus picked up Owen from Mrs. Chen's apartment, the weight of the day settling into something that wasn't quite relief but was closer to it than anything he'd felt in months. Owen was quiet on the drive home, sensing his father's complicated emotions. Did the police figure out what happened to those people? Owen asked. Yeah, buddy. They figured it out. And the families are getting answers they've waited a long time for. But you can't sell the barnwood anymore. No. But the people who owned the barn before the county took it, they're buying my salvage rights for enough money that will be okay for a while. Marcus paused, trying to explain something he was still processing himself. Sometimes doing the right thing costs you in ways that seem unfair. But sometimes other people recognize that cost and try to balance things out. Owen thought about this with the seriousness he applied to complicated ideas. So we're not getting evicted? No. We're not getting evicted. The $5,000 check cleared 3 days later, the fastest Marcus had ever seen a transaction process, as if David Morrison wanted to complete this payment before doubt or family pressure could change his mind. Marcus paid rent with money left over, bought Owen a winter coat that actually fit, got the truck's transmission fixed, and for the first time in months went to sleep not calculating how many days until the next financial crisis. But he couldn't stop thinking about the Morrison barn, about 3 men who'd been buried there for 57 years, about Helen Morrison's letter and the shame she'd carried to her grave. The memorial Patricia and David were planning would cost far more than $5,000, would require confronting their community with truths people had been comfortable not knowing, would transform their family legacy from respectable to infamous. They were choosing that burden, accepting responsibility for crimes they hadn't committed but had benefited from, trying to create something meaningful from something terrible. Marcus understood that kind of choice, recognized the weight of it, respected the courage it required to acknowledge hard truths instead of maintaining comfortable lies. The land had kept its secrets for decades, the Morrison barn standing silent over bodies that had waited patiently for someone to find them. Helen Morrison had trusted that eventually someone would, that truth would emerge even if she lacked the courage to speak it while alive. That trust had been rewarded by a desperate man buying salvage rights, by a 7-year-old boy noticing something wrong beneath the floor, by choices made to honor truth instead of profit. 3 men had been murdered over wages they'd earned. Marcus had found them because he was desperate for money he needed. The irony wasn't lost on him, the way desperation and wages and the value of human life all tangled together across 57 years, creating connections that nobody could have anticipated but that felt inevitable once revealed. The barn would become a memorial, but it would also stand as testament to something else, that buried things eventually surface, that silence eventually breaks, that the ground remembers everything that happens on it and gives up its secrets when the time is right. The forensic recovery team worked through late November, documenting everything beneath the Morrison barn floor with the meticulous care reserved for evidence that mattered. Marcus watched from a distance on several occasions, standing in the field where he'd first seen the barn and calculated its salvage value, now seeing it transformed into something far more significant than wood and metal. The structure that was supposed to save him from eviction had become a tomb being opened with reverence, 3 men finally being treated with the dignity denied them in death. Christine Clay attended every day of the recovery, standing vigil in a way that felt both personal and communal. She brought flowers on the 3rd day, left them near the barn entrance where police tape marked the perimeter, her grandmother's wedding photo propped against the stems. Other people started appearing too, descendants of Samuel Washington who'd driven from Michigan, distant relatives of Thomas Reed who'd been located through genealogy research and church records, local black families who remembered the men or remembered stories about them. The community's response fractured along lines Marcus was learning to recognize. Some people were horrified by the truth about James Morrison, felt betrayed by the revelation that a man they'd respected had been a murderer. Others were defensive, wanted to protect Morrison's legacy, argued that Helen's letter was unreliable or that the circumstances must have been more complicated than a simple wage dispute. A few, mostly older white residents, suggested that dredging up old history served no purpose, that the past should stay buried along with the men who'd lived it. But the evidence was undeniable. Helen Morrison's documentation was too detailed, too specific, too clearly written by someone who'd witnessed what she described. The physical evidence corroborated her account: 3 men buried with the kind of care that suggested guilt rather than concealment, personal effects preserved that identified them, even the placement beneath the barn floor matching Helen's description exactly. David and Patricia Morrison faced the firestorm with a determination that surprised Marcus. They could have minimized their grandfather's crimes, could have hidden behind legal distance or time's passage. Instead, they held a press conference acknowledging what James Morrison had done, apologizing to the families of his victims, and announcing their intention to create a memorial that would tell the complete truth. "Our grandfather murdered 3 men who'd done nothing wrong except ask for wages they'd earned," David said, his voice steady despite visible emotion. "He buried them like they were garbage, lied to their families, and lived out his life as a respected member of this community. That respect was unearned, was built on violence and theft and the racist assumption that black lives didn't matter enough to investigate seriously." Patricia stood beside her brother, her face showing the weight of what they were acknowledging. "We benefited from what he built, from the farm and the reputation and the wealth he accumulated through stolen labor. We can't undo that, can't bring those men back, can't compensate their families adequately for 57 years of not knowing. But we can stop perpetuating lies. We can create something that honors truth instead of protecting reputation." The backlash was immediate and vicious. David's business lost contracts from customers who felt he'd betrayed his family. Patricia faced calls for her resignation from the college. Both received hate mail from people who believed they were destroying a good man's legacy over allegations that couldn't be proven in court. But they also received support from unexpected places: churches and community organizations, historical societies interested in documenting difficult truths, younger residents who appreciated honesty about their town's past. Marcus watched all of this unfold while trying to stabilize his own life with the money David had paid for salvage rights that would never be exercised. The $5,000 provided breathing room, time to find steady work rather than scrambling for emergency income. He landed a job with a construction company doing historical restoration, work that paid decently and used skills he'd developed through years of salvage projects. Owen adjusted to their improved circumstances with the cautious optimism of a child who'd learned not to trust stability. He got new school clothes, winter gear that actually fit, regular meals that weren't canned soup or whatever was cheapest. But he also asked questions about the barn, about the men Marcus had found, about why some people were angry that the truth was being told. "People don't like finding out their heroes weren't good," Marcus explained one evening while they were cooking dinner together, the kind of real meal they could finally afford. James Morrison was somebody's grandfather, somebody's memory of a respected farmer. Learning he was a murderer destroys that memory, makes them question everything they believed about him. But he was a murderer, Owen said with the clear logic of children who hadn't learned to value comfortable lies over hard truths. The men he killed were real people who had families. Those families deserved to know what happened. "You're right. But people are complicated. They can hate what James Morrison did while still wanting to protect the idea of who they thought he was." Marcus paused, trying to find words for something he was still working through himself. "The memorial that's being built, it's not just about the 3 men who died. It's about everyone involved, the victims, the murderer, the wife who kept silent, the descendants who have to face what their family did. All of it matters, all of it's part of the story." The burials happened in December, 3 separate services for 3 men who'd been found together but whose families wanted individual recognition. Marcus attended all 3, feeling obligated by the fact that his desperate need for salvage income had triggered their discovery. He stood in the cold at Robert Clay's service, listening to Christine speak about a grandfather she'd never met but whose absence had shaped her family for 2 generations. "My grandmother carried the weight of not knowing for 43 years, Christine said, her voice carrying across the cemetery where Robert was being buried next to the wife who'd died still believing he'd abandoned her. She told herself stories to explain his disappearance, that he'd found better work elsewhere, that he'd gotten in trouble and had to run, that maybe he'd just decided family was too much burden to carry. None of those stories were true, but she died believing one of them because the real truth was buried under James Morrison's barn floor. Samuel Washington's service drew family from 3 states, descendants who'd scattered north during the Great Migration and who returned now to bury a man whose disappearance had been a wound their family carried across generations. Thomas Reed's service was smaller, his family harder to trace, but the people who came spoke about a young man whose life had been cut short just as it was beginning, whose potential had been buried along with his body. Marcus watched the Morrison descendants at each service, David and Patricia standing apart from the families, not intruding on grief but present as witnesses to what their grandfather had done. Their presence was uncomfortable but important, a physical acknowledgement that truth required facing the people harmed rather than just issuing statements from a safe distance. The memorial's construction began in January, transforming the Morrison barn from crime scene back to property but with purpose that transcended salvage value. The structure was too deteriorated to fully restore, but architects and preservation specialists developed a plan that maintained the barn's bones while creating a space that could tell its story. The floor where the men had been buried would be preserved behind glass, visible but protected, with their names and photographs displayed alongside Helen Morrison's letter in the historical context of what had happened. Marcus was surprised when David Morrison called him in February, asking if he'd be willing to consult on the memorial's construction. "You understand salvage, understand old buildings, understand what's worth preserving versus what needs to be replaced. I'd like your input on how we honor this structure while making it serve the purpose it needs to serve." The work became a strange kind of collaboration, Marcus working alongside architects and historians to figure out how to transform a murder site into a memorial that honored victims while acknowledging the full complexity of what had happened. They preserved the oak framing that had held the barn together for 70 years, restored sections of the original board and batten siding, kept elements that showed the building's agricultural history while adding interpretive displays that told the story of the men who'd died there. Christine Clay served on the memorial's advisory board, her voice ensuring that Robert's story, and by extension Samuel's and Thomas's, was told with accuracy and respect. She pushed back against suggestions that would have softened the truth, insisted that James Morrison be identified clearly as a murderer rather than hidden behind euphemisms about tragic events or difficult circumstances. "My grandfather was murdered over $340, she said during one particularly contentious meeting about the memorial's interpretive text. James Morrison shot 3 unarmed men who'd done nothing except ask for wages they'd earned. That's not a difficult circumstance, that's not a tragic event. That's murder motivated by racism and rage. If we're building this memorial, it needs to say that clearly." The text that emerged was unflinching, contextualizing the murders within the history of racial violence in rural communities, acknowledging Helen Morrison's complicity through silence while also recognizing the courage it took to document truth even if she couldn't speak it while alive. It named all the players, victims, murderer, witnesses, and traced the impact across generations, showing how 3 deaths in 1967 had created wounds that festered for 57 years until Marcus lifted a floorboard and exposed what had been hidden. The memorial opened in late May on what would have been Robert Clay's 95th birthday, a date chosen by Christine as a way of marking the life he should have lived rather than just the death that ended it. The ceremony drew hundreds of people, family members of the victims, local residents curious or supportive or still angry about truth being told, historians and journalists documenting a community reckoning with difficult history, students from Patricia Morrison's ethics classes witnessing what moral courage looked like when applied to family legacy. Marcus attended with Owen, both of them standing toward the back as speakers addressed the crowd. Christine spoke about her grandfather with the kind of specific detail that comes from family stories, describing a man who'd been funny and reliable and had loved his wife fiercely, whose absence had created a hole in his family that had never been filled. Descendants of Samuel Washington and Thomas Reed spoke similarly, giving humanity and dimension to men who'd been reduced to victims, showing they'd been fathers and sons and brothers whose lives had mattered beyond the violence that ended them. David Morrison spoke last, his voice carrying the weight of what this memorial had cost him personally and financially, of the relationships strained and business lost and reputation damaged by choosing truth over comfortable mythology. I've spent my life proud of my grandfather, believing he represented something good about hard work and community values. Learning what he actually was, what he did to 3 innocent men, destroyed that pride. But it also created an obligation. To tell the truth, to honor the people he harmed, to build something that serves memory instead of mythology. After the speeches, people filed through the memorial, reading the interpretive displays, looking at the preserved floor where the bodies had been found, studying photographs of Robert and Samuel and Thomas alongside images of James Morrison and the Morrison farm in its working years. The displays didn't flinch from difficulty, showed Helen Morrison's letter in full, included newspaper clippings from 1967 that documented how the men's disappearances had been barely investigated, how black lives in that era were considered less worthy of official concern. Owen stayed close to Marcus, reading everything with careful attention, his young face serious as he processed information about violence and racism and the long shadows cast by crimes that went unpunished. When they reached the section about Marcus finding the bodies, about his decision to call police rather than continue his salvage work, Owen looked up at his father with something approaching pride. "You could have just ignored them," Owen said quietly. "Could have covered them back up and sold the wood like you planned." "Yeah, I could have. But you didn't, even though it cost us money we really needed." Marcus knelt to Owen's eye level, wanting his son to understand this clearly. Those men deserved better than being ignored because it was convenient. Their families deserved truth even if it came 57 years late. Sometimes doing right costs you, but the cost of not doing right is worse. Christine found them before they left, her face showing exhaustion mixed with something that might have been peace. "Thank you," she said to Marcus. "Not just for finding my grandfather, but for understanding what it meant. For doing this right when you had every reason to take shortcuts. I'm sorry it took so long. Sorry your grandmother never knew what happened. So am I. But maybe it matters that eventually someone cared enough to tell the truth, that my grandfather's name is finally spoken with respect instead of just disappeared like he never mattered." Christine paused. "David told me he hired you to consult on the memorial construction. You did good work here." After the ceremony, after most people had left, Marcus walked through the memorial alone, studying the barn that was supposed to have been his salvation through salvage but had become something far more significant. The oak beams he'd planned to sell were still there, still structural, but now they served a different purpose. The floor he'd started removing board by board was preserved as evidence, as testimony, as reminder that truth eventually surfaces no matter how carefully it's buried. The memorial would stand as long as the building's bones held, would tell its story to whoever came seeking to understand how violence and silence and eventually revelation had shaped this place. It would honor Robert Clay and Samuel Washington and Thomas Reed not just as victims but as complete human beings whose lives had value beyond the murders that ended them. It would acknowledge James Morrison's crimes without reducing him to pure evil, showing instead how racism and economic pressure and personal rage had created a man capable of killing over wages he was too proud or too broke to pay. And it would recognize Helen Morrison's complicated legacy, a woman who'd witnessed murder, who'd lived decades with that knowledge, who'd lacked the courage to speak while alive but had ensured truth would emerge after death. Her letter hung in the memorial's final section, its handwriting shaky but its message clear, a confession and apology and plea for the truth to matter even when the people who needed to hear it were long dead. Marcus thought about Helen often as spring turned to summer, about the weight she'd carried and the trust she'd placed in whoever might eventually find what she'd hidden. That trust had been rewarded through his desperation, through circumstances that had made a $450 barn seem like salvation. He'd lost the salvage income he'd needed, but he'd gained something harder to quantify, the knowledge that sometimes stumbling into the right thing mattered more than achieving what you'd planned. His life had stabilized in ways that felt almost miraculous compared to where he'd been when he bought the barn. The restoration job paid well, provided health insurance for him and Owen, created the kind of financial security that allowed planning beyond the next rent payment. He'd even started saving, building the buffer he'd lacked when one unexpected expense could spiral into crisis. Owen flourished with the stability, his grades improving, his confidence growing, his understanding of the world deepening through proximity to difficult truths told honestly. The memorial had become part of his education, a place he returned to occasionally to read displays he'd missed before or to think about questions that had emerged since his last visit. On a warm evening in late August, Marcus took Owen back to the memorial on what would have been Samuel Washington's 92nd birthday, a date marked by the memorial's calendar as one of several days set aside for reflection and remembrance. They walked through the space slowly, reading sections they'd read before but which felt different with distance from the opening ceremony's emotion. They stopped at the section about Marcus's discovery, about the choice to call police rather than hide evidence, about the investigation that had followed. Owen read the text carefully, then looked at his father. "Do you ever wish you'd just kept salvaging? Just ignored the bodies and taken the money you needed?" Marcus considered this honestly, wanting to give his son truth rather than noble lies. "Sometimes, when the money was really tight and I was scared about keeping us housed. But mostly no. Finding those men, making sure their families got answers, that mattered more than barnwood or scrap metal. Their lives mattered more than my convenience. Even though it cost you what you needed? Even though. Because some things are worth the cost, even when the cost is high." Marcus paused, trying to explain something he was still working through himself. "I stumbled into doing the right thing because I was desperate for money and happened to buy the barn where those men were buried. That was luck or fate or just circumstances colliding. But once I found them, the choice was mine, do right or do easy. I chose right, and it worked out, but even if it hadn't, I'd still know I chose right. That matters." They stood together in the memorial that had been a barn, in the barn that had been a murder site, in the structure that had transformed through revelation and acknowledgement and the hard work of facing truth that would have been easier to keep buried. Outside, the land stretched away in patterns that had been there before the barn was built, before James Morrison had murdered 3 men, before Marcus had lifted a floorboard seeking salvage value and found instead testimony that demanded recognition. The memorial would stand, its oak bones solid, its story preserved for whoever came seeking to understand how violence and silence eventually gave way to revelation. Robert Clay and Samuel Washington and Thomas Reed would be remembered not as victims only but as men who'd lived and worked and mattered, whose deaths had created wounds that festered until truth could finally cleanse them. Marcus and Owen left as evening settled over the field, the memorial's lights coming on to illuminate displays that would be read by strangers and family members, by students studying difficult history and community members still processing what it meant that a respected farmer had been a murderer, that comfortable narratives could shatter when confronted with evidence too solid to deny. The barn stood witness to all of it, to the murders it had concealed, to the testimony it had preserved, to the memorial it had become. The land remembered everything, held every secret until the time came for revelation, gave up its buried things when desperation or determination or simple accident created the conditions for truth to surface. Marcus had bought that barn for $450, seeking what he could sell to keep himself and Owen housed. He'd found instead 3 men who'd been waiting 57 years for someone to care enough to tell their story, for someone to choose revelation over convenience, for someone to understand that some discoveries carry obligations that transcend personal need. He'd honored those obligations, had called police when hiding evidence would have been easier, had participated in the memorial's creation even after selling his salvage rights, had tried to do right by men whose names he'd never heard until he lifted the floorboard that revealed their graves. That was legacy in its truest form, not what you inherited but what you chose to honor, not what served your interests but what served truth even when truth was difficult. The memorial would tell that story alongside the story of the men who died and the man who killed them, creating something that acknowledged full complexity rather than simple narratives. The land had kept its secrets, and then had yielded them to someone whose desperation made him thorough enough to find what had been hidden. That was how truth worked sometimes, not through planned revelation but through accident and necessity, through circumstances that brought the right person to the right place at the right time to lift the floor and call the authorities and start the process of acknowledgement that should have happened 57 years earlier. Marcus drove home with Owen beside him, both of them quiet with their own thoughts about what they'd witnessed and participated in, about the barn that had been salvaged and became memorial, about the men who'd been forgotten and were now remembered, about the choices that defined character when the easy path was also the wrong one. The memorial stood behind them in the darkness, its lights marking truth that refused to stay buried, its structure honoring both the dead and the living who'd chosen to face difficult history rather than perpetuate comfortable lies. That was enough. More than enough. It was justice arriving late but arriving nonetheless, carried forward by a desperate man who'd needed barnwood and found instead buried testimony, who'd chosen revelation over profit and in doing so had helped heal wounds that had festered across generations. 5 years passed like seasons across the land, each one leaving its mark on the memorial the way weather shapes stone. Marcus watched Owen grow from the 7-year-old boy who'd first seen what lay beneath the Morrison barn floor to a 12-year-old young man whose understanding of justice and legacy had been shaped by proximity to difficult truths told honestly. The transformation wasn't dramatic, wasn't the kind of thing you notice day by day, but when Marcus looked at photographs from that desperate November when they'd had $32 and no plan, he barely recognized the scared father and frightened child they'd been. The memorial had become part of Millbrook's identity in ways nobody had predicted. School groups visited regularly, students learning about local history that went beyond sanitized textbooks, confronting the reality that their community had harbored violence that went unpunished for decades. The displays didn't flinch from difficulty, showed how racism and economic pressure and personal rage had created circumstances where 3 men could be murdered over wages and buried without investigation, their families left to wonder for 57 years what had happened. Christine Clay served as the memorial's volunteer director, giving tours and maintaining the building and ensuring that her grandfather's story, and Samuel Washington's and Thomas Reed's, was told with accuracy and respect. She'd retired from the bakery to do this work full-time, had found purpose in making sure the men weren't reduced to victims only but were remembered as complete human beings whose lives had value beyond the violence that ended them. Marcus visited occasionally, usually with Owen, both of them walking through spaces that had been crime scene and construction project and finally memorial. The barn's oak bones remained solid, supporting a structure that had been transformed without losing its essential character. The floor where the bodies had been found was preserved behind protective glass, a physical reminder that truth had been buried but eventually surfaced, that silence eventually broke when the right person looked in the right place. David Morrison had become an unexpected advocate for difficult history, serving on state commissions about truth and reconciliation, speaking at conferences about the cost and necessity of facing family legacy honestly. His business had recovered after the initial backlash, though he'd lost some customers permanently, gained others who respected his choice to prioritize truth over reputation. Patricia Morrison continued teaching ethics at the community college, using her family's story as a case study in moral courage and the complexity of inherited guilt. The relationship between the Morrison descendants and the families of the victims had evolved into something complicated but meaningful. Not friendship exactly, because the wounds were too deep for that kind of ease, but mutual respect and shared commitment to ensuring the memorial told complete truth. They gathered annually on August 22, the anniversary of the murders, for a remembrance ceremony that acknowledged all the people involved, victims, murderer, witnesses, descendants, and the ways violence echoed across generations. Owen had become the memorial's youngest regular volunteer at 11, helping with maintenance and sometimes assisting Christine with tours when school groups visited. Marcus watched his son explain the displays with careful accuracy, saw how the experience of being close to this history was shaping Owen's understanding of justice and responsibility and the weight of choices made when the easy path was also the wrong one. "The man who found the bodies is my dad," Owen would tell visiting students, pointing to the section about Marcus's discovery. "He bought the barn for salvage, needed money to pay rent, but when he found the men underneath he called police instead of just covering them back up and selling the wood. It cost him the income he needed, but it gave 3 families answers they'd waited 57 years to get." Marcus's life had stabilized in ways that felt almost miraculous compared to where he'd been that desperate November. The restoration job had led to other opportunities, contract work with historical preservation societies, consulting on projects across the region. He developed expertise in salvaging old structures while honoring their history, in finding the balance between practical reuse and respectful preservation. The work paid well, provided security, allowed him to build the kind of financial buffer that made unexpected expenses manageable rather than catastrophic. He'd even started dating, tentatively, a woman named Rachel who worked for the State Historical Commission and who'd been involved in designating the Morrison Barn Memorial as a protected historical site. She understood his commitment to Owen, respected the complicated relationship he had with the barn and what it represented, brought her own complicated history of loss and rebuilding. Nothing was certain yet, but the possibility of building something with another person felt less impossible than it had when he was barely keeping himself and Owen fed. On a cool October morning, 10 years after Marcus had lifted the floorboard that changed everything, the memorial hosted a special ceremony marking the recovery and identification of additional remains that had been found during recent construction work nearby. The expansion of a housing development had uncovered evidence of 2 more bodies, both dating to the same era, both showing signs of similar circumstances, black men who'd disappeared in the 1960s, whose families had been told they'd moved on or gotten in trouble or just abandoned their obligations. The discovery had triggered new investigation, new research into unsolved disappearances from that period, new acknowledgement that what happened to Robert Clay and Samuel Washington and Thomas Reed wasn't isolated but part of a pattern. James Morrison might have been the only murderer identified, but the ease with which he'd buried 3 men and faced no consequences suggested a system that made such crimes possible, a community that didn't value certain lives enough to investigate seriously when they disappeared. Christine stood before the gathered crowd, her face showing the weight of a decade spent ensuring her grandfather was remembered with dignity. "We thought finding 3 men was the end of this story," she said, her voice carrying across the memorial's main space. But it was just the beginning of understanding how many stories like theirs existed, how many families waited for answers that never came, how many men disappeared and were dismissed as unreliable or troublesome rather than investigated as possible victims. The memorial had expanded to include the newly discovered remains, to tell the broader story of racial violence in rural communities during the 60s, to acknowledge that justice delayed was justice denied but that truth eventually surfaced when people cared enough to look for it. Marcus had consulted on the expansion, had helped design displays that honored the additional victims while maintaining the memorial's focus on the specific story of what James Morrison had done and what Helen Morrison had documented. Owen, now 17 and preparing for college, had written his application essays about the memorial and what it meant to grow up in proximity to difficult truth. He'd been accepted to several schools studying history and social justice, wanted to pursue work that helped communities reckon with complicated pasts, had been shaped by a childhood that included finding bodies and watching how truth could transform shame into recognition. "I was 7 when we found them," Owen had written in one essay. "Too young to fully understand what it meant, but old enough to see my dad make a choice that cost him something he needed. He chose truth over convenience, chose honoring strangers over his own survival, and that choice showed me what integrity looks like when it's tested by real circumstances rather than hypothetical scenarios." Marcus had read the essay with pride mixed with the humility of knowing his choice hadn't been particularly heroic, just a man doing what seemed right because the alternative was living with knowledge that 3 families deserved truth he was capable of giving. But he understood what Owen was saying, recognized that children learn character not from lectures but from watching how adults behaved when circumstances made right and easy diverge. The field where the Morrison barn stood had changed over the decade, the wild scrub brush cleared back, walking paths installed, benches placed where visitors could sit and think about what they'd learned. The land itself seemed different, no longer holding secrets but breathing freely, the weight of buried truth lifted through revelation and acknowledgement. The creek that bordered the property still flowed in patterns older than human memory, but now it flowed past a place that honored rather than concealed, that spoke truth rather than perpetuating silence. David Morrison's health had declined in recent years, his body showing the stress of a decade spent confronting family legacy and trying to build something meaningful from inherited shame. He'd established a foundation that funded research into unsolved disappearances and racial violence, that provided support for communities trying to reckon with difficult histories, that ensured his family's wealth, built in part on James Morrison's crimes, was redirected toward justice his grandfather had denied. On a warm evening in late spring, 15 years after Marcus had bought the barn for salvage and found instead buried testimony, David called him with a request that carried the weight of final accounting. "I'm dying," David said without preamble, his voice showing the weakness of someone whose body was failing. "Cancer, spread too far to treat effectively. Doctors say I've got maybe 3 months." Marcus had come to respect David over the years, had watched him choose truth over comfort repeatedly, had seen him transform inherited guilt into meaningful action. "I'm sorry. That's hard. I wanted to tell you personally, wanted to thank you before I run out of time." David paused, gathering breath. "What you found, what you did by calling police instead of hiding evidence, that gave me a chance to be something other than James Morrison's descendant. Gave me the opportunity to face what he did and try to balance accounts that had been unbalanced for generations. I'm grateful for that. You did the hard work. I just lifted a floorboard. You could have covered it back up, could have pretended you saw nothing, could have taken what you needed and left 3 families still waiting for answers. You didn't, and that choice created possibilities nobody expected." David's voice grew quieter. "I've spent 15 years trying to honor the men my grandfather murdered, trying to build something that serves truth instead of mythology. I'm proud of what we've created, proud of the memorial and the foundation and the fact that Robert and Samuel and Thomas are remembered with dignity. That wouldn't exist without you." David Morrison died 6 weeks later, his funeral drawing people from across the state, family and friends, yes, but also descendants of his grandfather's victims, people whose lives had been touched by the memorial, community members who'd watched him transform shame into purpose. Patricia Morrison spoke about her brother's journey, about the courage it took to face family truth and the determination required to build something meaningful from inherited burden. David could have denied what our grandfather did, could have hidden behind time and legal distance, could have protected our family's reputation at the cost of honoring his victims, Patricia said, her voice carrying across the packed church. Instead, he chose truth. Chose to acknowledge James Morrison's crimes, chose to create a memorial that told complete history, chose to spend his wealth trying to balance accounts that could never be fully balanced. That was courage, and that was character, and that was legacy chosen rather than inherited. Marcus attended the funeral with Owen and Rachel, the 3 of them sitting quietly as David was celebrated and mourned. Owen had brought flowers to place at the memorial afterward, a gesture of respect for a man who'd shown that redemption was possible even when the crimes being addressed weren't your own. Christine Clay spoke at the graveside, her words carrying the complexity of someone honoring a man whose grandfather had murdered hers. "David Morrison didn't kill my grandfather, didn't bury him under a barn floor, didn't lie to my grandmother for 43 years. But he accepted responsibility for what his family had done, built something that ensured my grandfather was remembered with dignity, created a foundation that helps other families find truth about their own disappeared loved ones. That matters. That's legacy built through choice rather than inheritance." The years continued their steady progression, each one adding layers to the memorial story. Owen graduated college and returned to work at the memorial full-time, partnering with Christine to expand programs and outreach, to ensure new generations understood the history being preserved. Marcus watched his son find purpose in this work, saw how the experience of being 7 years old when bodies were discovered had shaped his entire understanding of truth and justice and the weight of choices made when circumstances tested character. Rachel became a permanent part of their lives, moving in after 3 years of dating, bringing her own strength and wisdom to a family that had been just father and son for so long. She and Owen developed their own relationship, not replacing the mother who'd abandoned him but creating something new that honored his loss while building something different. On a golden afternoon in late September, 20 years after Marcus had bought the Morrison barn for salvage, the memorial hosted its final major expansion, a research center and archive dedicated to documenting unsolved disappearances and racial violence throughout the region. The facility would house records and resources, would support families searching for truth about their own lost loved ones, would ensure that what happened to Robert Clay and Samuel Washington and Thomas Reed became part of larger understanding about systematic violence that had been dismissed for too long. Marcus stood at the dedication ceremony watching Owen speak about the importance of truth and the cost of silence, listening to his son articulate ideas that had been forming since he was 7 years old and had seen something beneath a barn floor that changed everything. Owen had become a voice for difficult history told honestly, for the principle that some truths were worth the cost of revelation even when keeping silent would have been easier. "My father found 3 men when he was looking for barnwood to salvage," Owen said, his voice steady and clear. He could have ignored them, could have taken what he needed and left families still waiting for answers. But he chose revelation over convenience, chose honoring strangers over personal survival, and that choice created everything we're standing in today. The memorial, the research center, the foundation that helps other families find truth, all of it started because one desperate man did the right thing when the easy thing was also the wrong thing. Christine stood beside Owen, her silver hair and weathered face showing the 20 years she'd spent ensuring her grandfather was remembered. "We thought finding 3 men was an ending," she said. "But it was a beginning, of understanding, of acknowledgement, of communities learning to face difficult histories instead of burying them. The barn that held my grandfather's body has become a place of truth, and that transformation happened because people chose courage over comfort." As evening settled over the memorial, as people mingled and explored the new research center, Marcus walked alone through the original barn structure that had started everything. The oak beams he'd planned to salvage were still there, still structural, but now they served a purpose he never could have imagined when he'd bid $450 on property nobody else wanted. The floor where he'd found the bodies was preserved behind glass, a physical reminder of secrets the land had held and eventually yielded. He thought about that desperate November morning, about Owen's small voice saying, "Dad, is that," and about the choice that had followed. He'd lost the salvage income he'd desperately needed, but he'd gained something harder to quantify, the knowledge that sometimes stumbling into the right thing mattered more than achieving what you'd planned. Rachel found him there, understanding without words why he'd needed this moment alone. They stood together looking at the memorial that had been a murder site, at the barn that had been salvaged and became testimony, at the structure that had transformed through revelation and acknowledgement and the hard work of facing truth that would have been easier to keep buried. "You changed a lot of lives by lifting that floorboard," Rachel said quietly. "I was just trying to pay rent. The rest just happened because I couldn't figure out how to do the wrong thing once I knew what was buried there. That's still a choice. A lot of people would have chosen differently." Marcus thought about this, about the years of consequence that had flowed from one moment of deciding to call 911 instead of covering up bones and continuing his salvage work. "I got lucky that doing right eventually worked out. But even if it hadn't, even if I'd lost the apartment and we'd ended up homeless, I'd still know I chose right. That would have mattered even if nothing else good came from it." They walked out together as twilight painted the sky in shades of amber and rose, the memorial's lights coming on to illuminate displays that would be read by strangers and family members, by students studying difficult history and community members still processing what it meant that comfortable narratives could shatter when confronted with evidence too solid to deny. The land stretched away in patterns that predated the barn, predated James Morrison's crimes, predated human claims entirely. It had held secrets and then yielded them, had carried the weight of buried truth until circumstances brought the right person to the right place at the right time. The creek still flowed, the soil still remembered, the fields still bore witness to everything that had happened here, the murders and the burial and the decades of silence and finally the revelation that had transformed hidden graves into honored memorial. Marcus stood at the edge of the property where he'd first seen the barn and calculated its salvage value, where he'd made the desperate gamble that $450 could somehow keep him and Owen housed for another month. He'd been wrong about what the barn would give him, but right in ways he couldn't have anticipated. Not money, but purpose. Not salvage income, but the knowledge that sometimes broken people stumbling into good fortune used it to honor something larger than their own survival. Above, stars appeared in patterns that had looked down on this land before the barn was built, before the murders happened, before Marcus lifted a floorboard seeking wood and found instead 3 men who'd been waiting 57 years for someone to care enough to tell their story. Those stars would continue after everyone currently alive was gone, witnessing the slow work of communities learning to face difficult truths and the quiet courage required to acknowledge history instead of burying it. The memorial stood in the gathering darkness, its structure solid, its purpose clear, its story preserved for whoever came seeking to understand how violence and silence eventually gave way to revelation. Robert Clay and Samuel Washington and Thomas Reed were remembered not as victims only but as men who'd lived and worked and mattered, whose deaths had created wounds that festered until truth could finally cleanse them. Marcus walked toward his truck where Owen and Rachel waited, his family built from loss and rebuilding and the stubborn determination to create something meaningful from whatever circumstances provided. The barn had given him more than he'd sought when he bought it for salvage, had taught him that sometimes desperation led to places that mattered more than profit, that sometimes the right thing cost you everything you thought you needed but gave you something more important in return. The land breathed in the evening air, its secrets told, its buried things surfaced, its truth preserved in oak and glass and careful documentation. The memorial would stand as long as the building's bones held, would tell its story to whoever came seeking understanding about how violence persisted through silence and eventually yielded to revelation, how justice delayed could still be justice served when people cared enough to honor truth over comfort. That was legacy in its truest form, not what you inherited but what you chose to build. Not what served your interests but what served truth even when truth was difficult. The memorial stood as proof that buried things eventually surface, that silence eventually breaks, that the ground remembers everything and gives up its secrets when the time is right and the person is willing to look. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.